Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to explore two very popular fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin E and vitamin D. And in my example with vitamin E, it actually comes from my husband. My husband obviously has lived with me for a long time, and he's followed through his own supplementation regime the current evidence on vitamins and minerals. And when the evidence on vitamin E became weaker and weaker, I suggested he stop taking his vitamin E. And he wouldn't do it, so I would remove it from the counter and it would come back, remove it from the counter and it would come back. And so I finally teased him that I thought he was actually married to his vitamin E because it was something that he couldn't give up. I've now convinced him vitamin E in a supplement form isn't probably what you want to do, and hopefully I can convince you as well. Okay, in the early 1990s, what did we know about vitamin E? Well, one of the things that we could automatically say was vitamin E was one of the most popular dietary supplements on the market. What were the claims associated with it? One of the claims is true. It's an antioxidant. And the thought was, could it reduce the incidence of heart disease and cancer? And some of the studies at that time suggested yes, and so consumers were driven to purchase this. Now I'm going to caution you again and again that we didn't have consumers going out and buying food sources of vitamin E, it was supplement vitamin E. Well, vitamin E may actually have some benefit in the reduction of chronic disease, but now almost every major study out there, major controlled trial, has suggested vitamin E is not the hero that we once thought it was. Major studies have failed to show an association between vitamin E intake and the prevention of chronic disease. Well, as the stock in vitamin E is actually falling, the role of vitamin D is expanding in human nutrition. But a word of caution here. If history has a way of repeating itself, we have to look at this with a critical eye and think, are we going to be in the same position years from now with vitamin D? And now replacing vitamin D will be the new vitamin du jour. What's going to be the new popular supplementation? In addition to vitamin D's well-known role in the development of bone, current research is considering that vitamin D may be needed outside of bone and actually in the prevention and management of other chronic common conditions. During this lecture, the functions and food sources and the current research surrounding these two dynamic fat-soluble vitamins will be explored. Okay, vitamin E basics. It was first discovered in 1922, and remember, the history of nutrition in the United States is relatively new. So it was discovered in 1922, where the deficiency of the vitamin caused sterility in rats. Okay, get your wheels going here, because where did we go with this information? Well, since that finding, early recommendations for vitamin E were as an aphrodisiac. Now, there's a difference between infertility and sexual desire, so this is a pretty common jump, but a misguided jump. It was also promoted for anything anti-aging, including gray hair, wrinkles, and impotence. Factually speaking, it's a fat-soluble vitamin, so where is it going to be stored? It's going to be stored in body fat, and clearly about 90% of your body's vitamin E is going to be in the fat. What about the functions of this powerhouse? Its primary role is as an antioxidant. Now remember, an antioxidant stabilizes cell membranes and prevents them from an oxidant. In this case, oxidation. Remember that rancid fat? So keep in mind the whole idea among these antioxidants is, can I protect the cellular integrity of that cell membrane? So it's thought to protect lung membranes from environmental contaminants, air pollution. It's thought to protect DNA from being altered or mutated. And it's also thought to protect against cardiovascular disease by protecting lipid from being oxidized. And remember that oftentimes, in part of that role of the development of heart disease, it's the oxidized LDL that is so lethal. So if I add vitamin E, can I prevent the lipid oxidation, in this case LDL cholesterol, from being oxidized? Well, vitamin E is not a compound, but it's a family of compounds known as tocopherols, with 8 different forms. This is really an important concept because as we talk about the good news, bad news about vitamin E, one of the things that you have to remember is form determines function. Form determines bioavailability. So in the studies that don't describe the form, we have to scratch our heads and say, would this be true for all forms of vitamin E? The most common form is alpha tocopherol, and it's the most common form of vitamin E in food and the most common form in supplements. Now, this vitamin can exist as two different isomers. It's just the way that molecule is configured in space. The synthetic form is DL, or in its natural food-based form is known as the D isomer. The bioavailability of the synthetic version is about half of the natural version. So remember, bioavailability is a really key component in human nutrition. There are other forms that are absorbed, but honestly they contribute less to the vitamin E requirement than alpha tocopherol. Okay, studies on vitamin E and heart disease, and this is where the science emerges, and quite honestly as a consumer this is what drives people crazy. One day vitamin E is good for you, the next day it isn't. And I think the challenge is nutrition as a science continues to emerge. So what's true today is going to have to be critiqued 5 years from now to see whether or not it still holds scientific water. Interest in vitamin E was generated when observational and sometimes epidemiological studies suggested vitamin E might lower the risk of heart disease. One of the most convincing studies was actually published in 1993 as part of the overall National Nurses Health Study that suggested that women who took vitamin E for more than 2 years had a 30 to 40% risk reduction in cardiovascular disease. Well, in the nutrition community, that turned the scientists on their ears. Aha, we maybe have a dietary solution to cardiovascular disease, and oh, by the way, it comes in a pill. At that time, other international studies suggested that vitamin E was also associated with a heart disease risk. So it wasn't just the research going on in the United States, it was worldwide. Okay, so now as scientists we start to explore, can we go longer term? Can we take a look at side effects? Maybe we should take a look at form. And then came the HOPE study. The HOPE study is where the vitamin E wheels began to come off. The HOPE study stands for Heart Outcomes, Prevention and Evaluation Trial. It's a long-term study evaluating in part the effectiveness of vitamin E. In this subset of individuals, these were individuals who had pre-existing vascular disease or diabetes. So these were people already on their way to developing heart disease. And keep in mind, vitamin E was thought to prevent heart disease, so why not take a look at the most vulnerable people, individuals who are on their way to developing heart disease, and see the effectiveness of vitamin E. Study was unique as it followed individuals for up to 7 years. Individuals were taking 400 international units of vitamin E, more than the requirement. The problem was there was no benefit in the prevention of heart disease or cancer in this group of individuals. So they were high-risk individuals at risk of developing heart disease, and there was no effectiveness of vitamin E. But here was the bad news. In individuals who were taking this vitamin E, there was an increased risk of heart failure. So, now we've got evidence that I'm not only taking vitamin E and there's no benefit, but now there's evidence of harm. Now, certainly other research studies at the time were saying, well, maybe it's not effective in heart disease, but maybe it'll protect the immune system. And supplemental vitamin E is thought maybe to reverse some of the age-related decline in immune function, but not for all of us. These are individuals who are living in a community setting like a nursing home, and in this particular study it was nursing home residents. Certainly preliminary research, and again this is what makes people a little crazy in interpreting nutrition studies, preliminary research suggests vitamin E may aid in the preservation of cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease. So again, we've got yes, some studies suggest yes, some studies suggest no, so is it a hero or is it not? Vitamin E in cancer, again, yes or no. A recent study by the American Cancer Society indicated that those who take vitamin E for approximately 10 years can reduce the risk of bladder cancer. So hold on a second here. This is chronic consumption of vitamin E. Now, how many of you can honestly say if you take a vitamin or a mineral that you're doing it every single day and you've done it every single day for 10 years? There might be some of you. but that's generally not the pattern of supplementation that we see. Observational studies suggested that maybe vitamin E and selenium together, because both vitamin E and selenium act as antioxidants, might be able to prevent prostate cancer. And the SELECT study, which stands for Selenium and Vitamin E Cancer Prevention Trial, demonstrated that this combination is not effective as a prevention strategy. So again, we've got this yes and no dichotomy of vitamin E. So the bottom line is, the current recommendations: get your vitamin E from food, stay away from supplements if you fall into that vulnerable category of already having vascular disease and diabetes, and where are we going to get it from food? What are our sources? Small amounts of vitamin E from several sources usually meet the requirement rather than one source. Food sources. Now, I want you to think back a few years ago when fat-free diets were the vogue. Food sources are oils, nuts, and seeds. So if you followed that craze, you were one of the people jumping on that bandwagon, you could have actually induced a vitamin E deficiency because you removed all your natural sources. So what are they? Wheat germ oil. Certainly we have vitamin E in fortified breakfast cereals. Sunflower seeds, so when you go to the ballpark, grab yourself a bag of sunflower seeds. Almonds, safflower oil, hazelnuts. In fact, most nuts are going to be a good source. Now keep in mind, if you're trying to control energy balance, when it comes to nuts, you have to control portion sizes. So a serving size of almonds is anywhere between 10 and 14 almonds. It's not a half a cup. So again, portion size is going to rule the day. Okay, cooking and processing, the storage can actually affect the vitamin E requirement. Safflower oil that's stored for up to 3 months can lose up to 55% of the vitamin E content. So a strategy there would be keep it in your refrigerator. If you keep it cool, you're going to actually hang on to more of that vitamin E. Roasting almonds can reduce the vitamin E content by 80%, and this is where some of the raw food movement comes in. Peanut oil can lose up to 1/3 of its vitamin E just by frying. Now, keep in mind that dietary analysis programs, or if you're looking up the vitamin E intake in a book, only list the amount of the vitamin in the original food, not how it's altered or affected by storage and processing. Okay, dietary requirements for vitamin E. Does form matter? Absolutely yes. It's a family of 8 compounds, and most of the studies that we talked about did not control for the type of vitamin E. So think of them as 8 different chemicals falling under all that one term. You got to really know the type of vitamin E that's in there. Again, the most common form is alpha tocopherol. Now, the higher your polyunsaturated fat intake, the more fat you need to protect against rancidity. And so the requirement for vitamin E is going to be affected by how much polyunsaturated fat you take in. Polyunsaturated fat, as you might remember, has many double bonds, making it vulnerable to oxidation. So the higher the polyunsaturated fat intake, the greater the need for vitamin E. The requirement for adults is in the range of 15 milligrams and 19 milligrams for breastfeeding women. Now, some supplement labels list that vitamin not in milligrams but in international units. If vitamin E is from natural sources, 1 IU, 1 international unit, is 0.67 milligrams of alpha tocopherol. If it's in a synthetic form, remember less effective, 1 IU is 0.45 milligrams of alpha tocopherol. And some of this will be in your guidebook for you to review. Now, are there disorders related to deficiency or excess? And vitamin E deficiency is so rare that the Food and Nutrition Board couldn't use signs of deficiencies to set requirements. It really only occurs in individuals with significant fat malabsorption or genetic disorders. In adults, because it's a fat-soluble stored vitamin, a deficiency may take up to 5 to 10 years to develop. Can it be toxic? As a fat-soluble vitamin, it's relatively non-toxic. However, large amounts, so if you decide you're going to continue taking large amounts of vitamin E, greater than 400 international units, it may interfere with blood clotting, particularly if you're taking it with anticoagulants or aspirin. A recent analysis of 19 studies suggests that for those with chronic disease, not just heart disease, taking 400 international units may increase mortality. So to me, that's going to be a toxicity. Vitamin E has also been recently linked with an increased risk of heart defects in the fetus of pregnant women. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about the new rising hero. And the rising hero is vitamin D. This has become such a clinical issue for us at Texas Children's and Sports Medicine. We now assess vitamin D status of most of the patients coming in the door. We actually draw blood. Why is this so important? Again, we got to get back to basics. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin that functions more like a hormone. It's not truly a dietary essential because if you spend time in the sun, you can make it in your skin. So some of the confusion with numbers with vitamin D is the current requirement is now under review. And I will suggest to you the next time the government reviews and changes requirements, this is one that's probably going to change, and by change I mean increase. Emerging science suggests it has functions in addition to bone health, that vitamin D may aid in the prevention of diabetes and heart disease, multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia because of the role of vitamin D in the brain, and certainly cancer. Now again, form and function are going to be significantly important. As with vitamin E, vitamin D is a family of many compounds, with only two being the most biologically active. Ergocalciferol is found in a few plant-based foods, also known as vitamin D2. And for those of you who like mushrooms, now you have an excuse. Mushrooms are a good source of vitamin D2. Cholecalciferol is found in animal-based foods and is known as vitamin D3. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. The skin can make a version of vitamin D from cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol does have great biological functions. And then send it to the liver and then on to the kidney for final activation. I'm going to tell you that this is a really significant finding when we start to talk about toxicity, because toxicity of vitamin D is in its fully activated form. And again, you have to have a cooperating liver and kidney to get to that final activation. According to an international expert on vitamin D, Dr. Michael Holick, having sun exposure enough to induce mild redness can be considered equal to a dose of 20,000 international units. So the sun becomes a very powerful ally. Now please don't misinterpret this. I'm not trying to induce skin cancer in order to protect your vitamin D status, but again, I think there's some dilemma with us spending so much time inside. Keep in mind this activation in the kidney and the liver is absolutely essential. So here you need a healthy kidney and a healthy liver. So the challenge is if I have pre-existing disease in any one of those organs, I might not be able to activate vitamin D. Okay, what are the primary functions of vitamin D? Its primary role is a regulator. It orchestrates. Consider it like the conductor of an orchestra. It tells cells what to do, and there are receptors for vitamin D on cell membranes and the nucleus of cells. So it really teaches that cell what it must do in terms of its physiological function. Certainly it regulates blood calcium level with the cooperation of other hormones. It's needed for normal beta cell function. The beta cell that produces insulin needs vitamin D for normal functioning, and there are some studies suggest it may be a preventative for diabetes. And that's unbelievably great news. What's the role of multiple sclerosis? Early studies suggest that the farther away you are, north or south of the equator, the more likely you are to develop MS. Data indicates if you are born and live for the first 10 years of your life above 35 degrees latitude, your risk of developing multiple sclerosis as an adult increases by 100% in a recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Unbelievably powerful information for us to have. Psoriasis is oftentimes considered an autoimmune disease, and some research suggests that vitamin D may actually protect your immune system. The current research on psoriasis and vitamin D might suggest it might be an adjunct for the treatment, but it's certainly not going to replace conventional medical therapy. Cancer prevention. Many studies support this, and vitamin D, again, acts as that cellular conductor, telling cells what to do and how to do their job. Again, I'm looking at this as unbelievably exciting information to have. So now what we're going to have is really requirements revisited. Despite our abilities to synthesize vitamin D, the Food and Nutrition Board has actually set requirements. So we can make vitamin D in our skin, but our government has chosen to set requirements for us. The recommended amount is set nationally despite varying levels of sunlight throughout the year. So think about this for a second. I live in Texas. If you live in Maine, the amount of vitamin D that I can make living in Texas closer to the equator is greater than you can. 5 micrograms, now not milligrams here, micrograms or 200 international units per day is the current requirement for those under 50. Individuals from about 51 to 70, the synthesis decreases in the skin. The skin becomes a less effective vitamin D producer. So therefore, the requirement is raised to 10 micrograms for those 51 to 70 and 15 micrograms for those over 70. Now again, we've got this difference between micrograms and international units. 1 international unit here is 40 micrograms. Now again, all of this is dependent on the synthesis of vitamin D in your skin. And there are many factors that can influence that. We've already talked about where do you live, but skin color. If you're African American, you have melanin in your skin that acts as a natural sunscreen, and you don't make as much vitamin D in your skin. Certainly, if you wear sunscreen, you can reduce the synthesis of vitamin D in your skin. So the general recommendation is it takes 10 to 15 minutes for sunscreen to actually be activated. And so what you do is you put the sunscreen on right as you walk out the door, and you're still going to have some synthesis of vitamin D in your skin. Time of day, 10 to 15 minutes per day, generally at the peak sun level, is a good amount of exposure. So again, we're not promoting sunburn, we're not promoting skin cancer. Season of the year and your clothing. If you live in Chicago, you're not exposing your arms and legs in January. And so realistically, your clothing could be a barrier based on the season of the year. Well, what are our food sources? Food sources are few, and they almost all are fortified. Milk can be fortified, and certainly if you get skim milk where they've skimmed off all the fat, you look at the label and it's going to tell you it's fortified with vitamins A and D, both fat-soluble vitamins, lost in the cream. Breakfast cereals are being fortified with vitamin D, and again we have this new concept of fortified orange juice. Oily fish can be a good source, and that would include salmon, or cod liver oil, but as we've mentioned before, cod liver oil that your grandma gave you was purer than the cod liver oil that you can buy now, and so oily fish would be a better option for you. Egg yolk, again that dreaded egg that's got milligrams of cholesterol, and butter. Okay, do we have disorders that are related to a vitamin deficiency or excess? The vitamin D deficiency, the classic deficiency, is rickets and osteomalacia. And what this actually means is a softening of the bones, a little different than osteoporosis, which means the bones are a little bit more brittle. Although this is relatively rare, if you're taking any kind of anti-seizure medication, for epilepsy for example, it can actually enhance the destruction of vitamin D, and left untreated can increase the development of bone disease. I've actually seen rickets in Houston in a girl who was a blue-eyed blonde. Now, why would a blue-eyed blonde, fair skin, end up with rickets? Because of sunscreen. She never left the house without sunscreen, and she refused, absolutely positively refused, to drink milk. Now keep in mind, a lot of people are drinking soy milk and rice milk and almond milk, and you really need to read the label to see whether or not they put vitamin D into that product, because it's not there naturally. Certainly, as we're talking about deficiencies, vitamin D deficiency can actually increase the fracture rate in older Americans, and also may explain why some people don't respond to traditional osteoporosis treatments. Estimates in the United States of vitamin D deficiency are emerging, and certainly a study in the journal Pediatrics suggests up to 50% of African American adolescents are vitamin D deficient. So I'm going to suggest to you this is the major nutritional deficiency disease in the United States. The challenge is that obesity and body fat sequesters or holds the vitamin D in the body fat, and what that means is it's not available in the blood. And so if my beta cell needs it or my central nervous system needs it, it's going to be held there. So the question that we have is the requirement correct? Well, many experts believe we have an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency because the requirement is too low. The requirement is too low. So what this means is that what you see as the 100% daily value on your supplement or on your breakfast cereal probably is not that level. Also, if you happen to be one of the 2/3 of Americans who is overweight, your vitamin D requirement is going to change based on the percent body fat that you have. Now, some experts suggest that the requirement for optimal blood levels, and this is where this science is going, may be as high as 2,000 international units. So, oh my, that's significantly more than the 200 international units that was recommended by the government. Maybe as high as 2,000 international units. Now, in order to correct blood levels, your physician may prescribe up to 50,000 international units per month to correct the deficiency. So you're thinking, oh my goodness, that must be a toxic amount. How does that work? Well, your physician may prescribe 50,000 international units in a once-a-month dose to correct the deficiency, and also may suggest that you take vitamin D in your food, you may take another multivitamin. And so the challenge is we're now looking at really large amounts of vitamin D that are being recommended. So shouldn't we be concerned about toxicity? Should we be concerned about toxicity? Sun exposure, now that's in the absence of skin cancer, sun exposure is not toxic, as the skin can down-regulate the amount of vitamin D precursor that's actually sent to the liver and then sent on to the kidneys. So the challenge is we've got the ability in our body that if we're making too much vitamin D from our skin, we can put the brakes on. The brakes can occur in the skin, the brakes can occur in the liver, and the brakes can occur in the kidney. So I think when people think of toxicity, keep in mind the sun is not going to give you a toxicity of vitamin D. Now, supplements can be toxic, and the Food and Nutrition Board has listed the upper tolerable limit at 2,000 international units. Well, wait a minute. Didn't I just tell you that was the recommended amount that a lot of experts were recommending? The answer is yes. But when we look at the toxicity of vitamin D, most of the studies will look at the fully activated form of vitamin D. And quite honestly, you can't buy that over the counter. It's the final step. So keep in mind, starts in the skin, goes to the liver, goes to the kidney. The kidney, that final resting spot, the kidney makes that fully activated vitamin D. And most of the toxicity symptoms that you see are related to prescription, not over-the-counter vitamin D supplements. So keep in mind, at 2,000 international units for what you can buy in the store, no toxicity symptoms have been documented at this level. Now, if indeed you take this fully activated prescription vitamin D, classic symptoms include higher blood levels of calcium, calcification of soft tissues, but again, this is not going to be the fully activated, this only is going to occur in the fully activated version. Now, the key here is you got to get your blood level of vitamin D checked at your next doctor's visit. So don't wait, put this on your list of things to do the next time you get a physical. If it's not offered to you, ask. This is going to be the best guarantee that you as an individual are getting an adequate amount. And your blood level, and again it depends on your lab that does your blood work, your blood level should be greater than 30 nanograms per milliliter. Nanograms per milliliter. So keep in mind you want to ask for that blood level. The great news is that we can forestall or prevent some chronic illnesses, but we got to know what our blood level is. Okay, frequently asked questions. I just told you getting a vitamin D assay at your doctor's office is a great idea. Are there any others? I hear that all the time. Shouldn't I get my riboflavin level checked, or shouldn't I get something else? Keep in mind, if there's not a disease associated with it, your insurance company isn't going to cover it. Okay? So, vitamin D, yes. If you're over the age of 50, I'm going to also suggest that you get a vitamin B12 level checked. If you've had gastric bypass, you are at risk of a vitamin B12 deficiency. If you have any kind of malabsorptive issue, if you have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, diseases that will be covered in future lectures, vitamin B12 deficiency could be prevalent. So keep that in mind. Some research also suggests that low levels of riboflavin in your blood may contribute to migraine headaches, and so that may be something else that you want to ask your doctor to do if you suffer from migraines. Vitamin E, again, there's lots and lots of science out there, and one of the things I hear all the time is vitamin E can diminish scars or incision marks if it's rubbed on the skin. Is that true? Well, vitamin E on the skin may act as a topical antioxidant, and there's no reason not to try it. Do we put any other topical antioxidants on our skin? Absolutely. I can go buy vitamin C and apply it to my skin. If you've ever heard of Accutane, which is a vitamin A derivative for the treatment of acne, that is a topical antioxidant. Renova, those kinds of products that are used for anti-aging are actually topical forms of vitamin A. So there's absolutely no reason not to try it. If you have a benefit, that's great. If you don't, maybe you have adequate amounts of vitamin E in your blood supply, and adding more to the skin isn't going to make any difference. With all the hype about vitamin D, can I take it all at one time, or is there a limit? Current science suggests, you know what, absolutely take it all at one time. It's fat soluble, it's absorbed in a very easy fashion, and there really shouldn't be any reason to try and split your dose. And thank you all very much.